Today we're going to look at a story of a dead man. So I'll start with this question. Do you remember the first funeral you went to? The first person that you really loved who died? I can still remember the first funeral I went to. I was 10 years of age. My grandpa George died. I absolutely loved my grandpa George. All of my memories of my grandpa George are fantastic. Upstairs, near my bedroom, there's a photo of him. I remember him all the time. Tell my kids stories about Grandpa George. He was loving, fun, spent tons of hours at his house, go out to breakfast, hang out, build stuff. I remember him teaching me how to ride a bike that was way too big, and I almost killed myself. I remember he was great teaching me how to use lots of woodworking tools and to build things. He built me my first basketball hoop, and I can still remember going to his funeral. And the intent, I'd really not ever thought about death. Never really considered that Grandpa George would die. And I remember going home from the funeral, and every time I'd shoot hoops, it just seemed curious to me that the backboard that I had made with my grandfather outlived my grandfather. Death is painful. It's usually preceded by suffering. Sometimes it is completely unexpected, and it comes for us all because the wage for sin is death, and all have sinned. And this world is not the way that God made it to be. This is the way that we have made it to be through sin and rebellion and folly. And when we suffer, sometimes we do foolish things and get angry and bitter and mad at God for suffering that He didn't create, that we did. And as we get into the story, you're going to meet a woman who is at a funeral. And I want you to emotionally connect with this widow who is burying her only son. Horrible, horrible, horrible day. You're going to have days like that in your life where you're absolutely wrecked. You will be wrecked. Some of you will be there for a gaze and a glimpse into the days of other people's lives when they are absolutely wrecked. When suffering comes, when sickness comes, when death comes for them. To be honest with you, I wasn't really at all prepared for this going into ministry. We started Mars Hill as a Bible study about 14 years ago. And at the time, I was 25, gathering a core group. And I thought, okay, I'm going to teach the Bible, I'm going to love people, or we're going to see lost people meet Jesus. And I was not prepared at all for the devastation of wrecked lives. Hadn't been a pastor at any church, had never been a member at any church. We didn't gather a lot of mature, healthy, helpful people. We gathered a lot of broken, devastated, wrecked, largely young, non-Christian people. I still remember my first hospital visit. All my hospital visits to that point, and there had only been a few, were to go congratulate someone because their baby was born. And I got a call from a young man in the congregation, was a newer Christian, came from a rough background. He had no living family except for his mother. And he said, I need you to come to the hospital. It's an emergency. So I got in my car and went downtown very late at night. And I met him in the waiting room, and I said, okay, what's the situation? He said, well, you know my story, new Christian, non-Christian family. My mom's my only living relative. She went to a Seattle area park, doused herself in gasoline in her car, and set herself on fire. And she's brain dead. Her entire body is burned up, but they've got her heart beating on a ventilator. What do I do? Because she's not a Christian, and she doesn't love Jesus. And if I pull the plug, she dies and goes to hell, and this is my only relative. What do I do? I'm just sitting there thinking, I am not ready for this. This man deserves far more than I'm able to give him at this point. And as a pastor over the years, just continually being wrecked in my own life and seeing other people's lives get wrecked and being wrecked for them. That's why I always hate it when pastors just make every story a good story and every verse a happy verse and every tale has a glorious ending, and they don't really do the work of connecting with people who are suffering and hurting. Sometimes we get complaints as a church, oh, those big mega churches, they just don't care about people. No, if you care about people, sometimes you get a lot of them. That's how we built this church. We care for hurting people, and so lots of hurting people come. If you just took all the women in our church who were raped or molested, you would have a mega church of just victims. We're not immune as pastors and leaders from the suffering and the pain and the hurt in people's lives, and that includes individual pastors. I'll tell you a story about Pastor Chris Swan. He's a campus pastor over at our Bellevue campus. Been a friend of mine for over a decade. I'll get the numbers right. His wife, Susan, is fantastic. They've had 26 pregnancies and 3 children and 23 miscarriages. 23 miscarriages. Pastor Chris, on his body, he's got the number 18, the number 20, and the number 25 tattooed on his body. Those are the 3 pregnancies that actually resulted in children. Above those numbers is tattooed the name of his wife, Susan, as a memorial to her, that she's been through a lot. They finally, after having a few daughters and desperately wanting a son, decided, we're just going to need to stop trying. At this point, let's just stop. And so he had a vasectomy and ultimately just accepted that he would never have a son. And then he felt that God spoke to him and said, I'll give you a son, trust me again, and have a reversal. So he did, and had a few more miscarriages. And then God in his grace gave him a baby boy. I've seen that boy, he's spoiled. Between his sisters and his mother and his dad, he is well cared for. Pastor Dave Bruskus, your Albuquerque campus pastor, I asked people to write up their stories on Facebook and the city. I have maybe hundreds of them. I can't share them all with you. Pastor Dave Bruskus wrote his story. He said, from the time I became a 13-year-old Christian, I prayed God would give me a son that would change the world. Kara, his great wife, and I had one daughter, Lisa, at the time. Our son, David Michael, was born. Ultrasounds detected no problems, nor were there any evidences of illness during his birth. Within hours of his birth, we discovered he had a congenital heart defect and would require surgery. His cardiologist gave us this prognosis. David would be a little kid who could jump off the diving board and swim in the pool, but his heart condition wouldn't allow him to compete on a swim team. This seemed like a minor issue, as we would love and enjoy the son we had prayed for with his small limitations. David was transported to the Children's Hospital ICU for surgery. 2 months and 4 days later, David's heart simply gave out. He had undergone many surgeries and many more procedures. Nothing like seeing a little kid who's got a lot of scars. We never saw him successfully removed from his ventilator. He never left the ICU. I held him in my arms as the doctors disconnected his life support. And he went to be with Jesus quickly. I think David's death has impacted me in several ways. First, I've learned Jesus is real and comforts those who hurt. I have never before or since experienced his presence more powerfully than on the day we buried our son. And Jesus is better than all the sons and daughters he gives to mom and dad. Second, the ache never goes away completely. It isn't as constant as it used to be, but there are still moments that I slip away and weep or that Kara and I spend date nights remembering David through tears. Third, I am so grateful for every moment that I have with my children. I no longer fear death as an unknown entity, theirs or mine. But I do realize, while eternity is guaranteed through Jesus, tomorrow on earth isn't. Lastly, I long to be with Jesus, totally freed from sin, away from this fallen world. Not so much in a morbid way, but like Paul, who says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." The last time I held my son was to release him to be with Jesus. The next time I hold him, we will both be with Jesus forever. Dave's a good friend. Every time he comes to the house, he was over recently, I see him watch my 3 boys. And they're usually doing something ridiculous. And he just watches them. And you can tell that he wishes his son was alive. I got here this morning, I got a text message from one of my dearest friends. He is vice president of Acts 29, pastors a church in St. Louis. He says, please pray for my 7-month-old daughter. She has a very severe and rare form of staph infection, and we're rushing her to the hospital right now. Your life is going to be wrecked. My life is going to be wrecked. And the more people you love, the more occasions you will have to be wrecked.